With that, I just want to now go into what we're all really excited for, which is our keynote speaker, Nick Moore. We're thrilled to have him here. Just as some background for those who don't know who Nick is, Nick currently serves as the Acting Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration. Nick most recently served as the Alabama Governor's Office of Education and Training Workforce Transformation, where he focused on doing a lot of really great work in Alabama, aligning the education and workforce programs, implementing Alabama's state longitudinal data system, establishing Alabama's non-degree credential quality and transparency system, and curating a competency-based education and skills-based hiring system in Alabama. He was busy. And so we're just thrilled to have Nick here with his wealth of expertise based on all of the work that he's done. He's been a longtime friend of the NCRN. I remember being on panels with Nick back when he was in Alabama and part of this community. And now we're really thrilled to have him with us today to share his perspectives on where things are going at the federal level and all the policy work that he's been working on right now. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that very kind introduction, Michelle. And I feel like I'm in a room full of friends looking around the room. I'm just kind of coming full circle here to think about all the folks that I've conspired with in just over really the past 10 years. So if we just think about putting into perspective, I remember, Michelle, when you put your book out about non-degree credentials and what you mentioned, Kyle, it was kind of before non-degree credentials started becoming cool. But I think we're there now, and part of it is like, the dog finally caught the bus, and now competency-based education, skills-based hiring, non-degree credentials, Workforce Pell, you name it, and with AI in the background has become the topic du jour, not only within the Beltway here, but across the country. And I think what I'll start by saying is there's both something we should feel excited about, but also a little bit nervous because this group here really has a big task ahead of it and a lot of weight on your shoulders right now because despite all of the great work that we've done over the past decade, there's still a lot more to do. And particularly with states and governors as we begin connecting the dots not only between degree and non-degree pathways, but we leverage technology, we leverage AI, large, medium, and small language models to create a currency of skills that I think is actually going to be the way that we unwrap the Gordian knot, that we no longer keep having conversations about, we're going to live in a world of degrees only or everyone's going in a non-degree pathway. And that's probably the thing that frustrates me the most, but also motivates me, is knowing that despite and I know we've got everybody here understanding that, but many people still don't quite understand the fact that we don't have to live in a world that's mutually exclusive, time and credit-based assertions on the one hand, or non-degree or self-asserted assertions on the other hand, that these things are in fact mutually, are really integrally linked. And so if we think about where to start, I think we've got to have a conversation about trust. And I know that's been a big topic that you're going to discuss here, but also one that I know many governors are going to be having now that I hope everybody here was excited to see the Workforce Pell final rule was promulgated. And we were excited that when the rule came around for changing the student loan limits and the first negotiated rulemaking for OB3, we had about 40,000 comments. So the fact that we only had 400 comments on Workforce Pell shows that everybody was either collectively exhausted after the first neg reg, or maybe we landed a little bit closer to what the kind of consensus was. And I think part of that is the fact of the work that you had already done. I know personally folks like me and Merrick Lako that were involved in the process, were building on the work that you had done to make sure that there was generally broad consensus on not only connecting credit and non-credit, but also thinking about how do we make sure that we've got the robust administrative data systems, labor market information, and policies to help states expand things like UI wage records, state longitudinal data systems, make sure that we're not just adding data into a black hole, we don't get anything back, and that the work that you are doing is powered by as close to real-time research data. You know, it's very tough to do the type of quasi-experimental level research and you know, really plan designs if you've got low-quality data. And so, you know, as we reflect on the work ahead, I want to spend just a few moments thinking about some of the folks that were really key on taking us to where we have gone so far. And so think about the work that Lumina has done. I know Kermit is here. And if we think, you know, when the first attainment goal was set, that was, I think, the beginning of opening the sort of national mind's eye and understanding the value proposition of non-degree credentials, and thinking about the fact that, you know, a high watermark for labor force participation in this country was the year 2000. Nobody could argue that our economy is less dynamic today than it was then, but we've got to think about what are the barriers to entry, the benefit cliffs people are facing that can make it difficult for them to enter and persist in paid employment and post-secondary education. And part of that is the fact that terminal credentials or longer-term credentials sometimes were just not in the cards for a lot of working adults, for veterans, for people that maybe were justice involved that are re-entering into society. And so the fact that we could think about unbundling and modularizing a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree and then stack those back up, I think is very powerful. And so folks that are sitting in governor's offices and are trying to figure out how do we increase labor force participation finally began to understand that you're not going to do that without a concurrent focus on post-secondary attainment. So we know from the work that I see Stephanie there, you've been counting credentials quite a bit, and I know that a lot of other folks like Credential Engine, I saw Scott Cheney, I guess couldn't be here. He was still over at the NGA. He's got a Skills in the States thing that also fellow travelers going on today. So a lot of work in this topic going on this week. But if we know that there's more than 1.5 million non-degree credentials on the market, some of them are really high quality, some of them are more like wooden nickels. And so how do you separate the wheat from the chaff, and particularly for people who don't have the opportunity to have, you know, misplaced opportunity. So if you've got somebody whose basic needs aren't being met, or you got a young person and maybe they're going to take one more shot at going into post-secondary education, if we don't deliver a quality program for them, then what's the chance for them of going back and trying at it again? So this work is not only important from a policy perspective, it's important for millions of individuals who the work that you're doing day in and day out is going to be a critical lifeline. And maybe they don't even see it today, but they will as they get that first credential. They're able to move in to a job that pays a self-sufficient or self-sustaining wage. They become economically self-sufficient. And that's also a very powerful way for us to update and modernize our nation's public workforce system. And so if you think about the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, every state has an eligible training provider list. But if you've seen one eligible training provider list, you've seen one eligible training provider list. And I know back in my home state of Alabama, when we first started the work under Governor Ivey, we had about 800 disparate programs and associated credentials on that list. And it looked like basically any lobbyist or group that came up and just asked for it to be added to the list, it was. And so where that started to change is where we set out a clear state-defined process for not only credential transparency, but also credential quality. And I know that's going to mean a little bit, you know, something a little bit different to every state. And I know some of you in this room, because I read some of your comments on Workforce Pell, wish that maybe we more fully defined what stackability and portability meant. That was intentionally not defined because I think we're still somewhat in the nascent salad days of that work still. And I know that may be hard to hear for as much as you've done on it, but I don't think the concrete is quite settled, particularly when you add in the focus around talent marketplaces, which I'm going to get into in a minute. So where the main sort of through line of action is going to be for the next, particularly 18 months, is going to be on governors and state workforce boards sort of awakening from their dogmatic slumber and really being in charge of that process of defining for their state, hopefully codifying that, putting it in a state law, what are the qualitative and the quantitative factors that we need to see on a credential, whether it's a PhD or it's a 6-week welding credential. But the work, the baseline that's been set by the folks in this room is helping to inform that. It's things like cost reasonableness, portability, the idea that you want to have a wage premium over a high school diploma, that you want to make sure that we're able to describe the discrete industry recognized competencies that we're going to associate with it. And that's important because we're very interested in updating and modernizing some of the systems of record that we've heard from you that we know to be a little too static and wooden, like ONET or like the Competency Model Clearinghouse. Now, those are good things to have because we don't have much else in lieu of those things. And we certainly don't want to revert to a sort of Tower of Babel situation to where everybody describes the skills that go into every job differently. Every institution has a different way of associating value. So states are probably the smallest sort of subnational jurisdiction to where you've got enough actors on the supply side, the demand side, enough institutions, employers to create signaling mechanisms to incent behavioral change. So what I mean by that is imagine a world where with ONET, rather than having a survey go out and maybe 2% of the respondent, we probably get more like 12. Most people get like 2% responses on a survey like that. But imagine if we had a qualification framework that spelled out the DNA of every 6-digit SOC code, right? And then we're able to describe that as a sort of semantical framework for an employer, and they're able to customize that, and we're updating ONET based on the permutations and combinations and ways that at the firm level, employers are making those customizations. And so that is the beginning of where the work between non-degree credential research and the work of talent marketplaces can really take off. Even when this group started, the idea of being able to not require an institution to have to throw out their student information system or employer to get a new ATS or HRIS system, that really wasn't on the table. But what we can do now with AI is on the back end be able to match course outcomes, SIP codes, and not this static old school SIP-SOC crosswalk, but to truly be able to connect course outcomes and syllabi to a 6-digit SOC code so that we've got the beginnings of a national public utility for occupational data mobility and the beginnings of what could potentially be a new standard for not only learning and employment records, but a way to reimagine UI wage records for us to think about how we collect administrative data at the state level to inform this reciprocal feedback loop. So in my thought process, in 5 years from now, what we will see is a system of interoperable talent marketplaces that include a credential registry that's not just the phone book of credentials and big lists, but it's got the provenance and the skills data that undergird that credential, because that's honestly, if we're being honest, the skills and the competencies, that's what has value in the labor market. The credential is just a wrapper, a bundle, and the credential is supposed to validate and vouchsafe mastery of those skills, but it's just till now we've never been able to make sense on how do you create that labor market signal for something beyond a degree. And so it doesn't have to be just in any particular permutation. It could be sort of sub-degree too, if we think about it in terms of just a interoperable system of competencies. So if you've got a credential registry that powers putting the skills data onto the credential, and I know when you get Credential Engine and CredLens working together, those combination there, we can also think about how do you scaffold on proficiency levels. Because if you think about the confluence between a credential and the application to a particular occupation, somebody may need to know that skill much stronger in one job than they would in another, and then how do you, call balls and strikes on levels of proficiency. So you've got to have a way of not only just thinking about the credential without the context of the occupation. But you've also got to have a way for someone to have a self-sovereign, interoperable learning and employment record that's a way for them to transact, transcribe, and translate all of their learning assertions into the labor market. And to be able to do that as they matriculate through different institutions along their secondary to post-secondary to workforce journey, but also through different verticals within the same industry, between other industries. And there's always sort of a growth and deficit-based thought process on this, particularly with employers, and with institutions, quite frankly. I mean, there's some that want to lean into that to say, yes, we want to give all of our students, all of our employees access to this self-sovereign data so that they can be the master of their own destiny as they move forward in their journey. Some say, well, I'm honestly just training my competition's next employee for a quarter more. But just like the Luddites have generally been wrong throughout history, I also think people that have that deficit-based mindset are also, more prone to being monopsonists, and they're just trying to suppress their wage inputs to try to stay whole in tight markets. So those people generally lose out. I think that institutions, the employers, those that lean into this are going to have a dividend that pays off over the next decade. Those that are laggards or fence setters, they may catch up, but the people that are just digging their heads in the sand, they don't think about adopting talent marketplaces, they don't think about how to reimagine their accreditation, they don't work with their faculty to be able to modularize their degrees. A lot of those institutions aren't going to be around in 10 years. So that's not just, I'm just saying the quiet part out loud. Those are things that people know, but often don't get said. So the third part of that, you got your credential registry, you got your LER. Where the match happens is when you've got a skills-based job description generator so that the employer can take that semantical framework of a job, customize it, and then create a candidate pool based on geography, solely based on a competency match, and that reduces a lot of the friction and the biases out of the hiring process. There's probably no industry in this country that is more rife with friction than the process of connecting somebody with a credential to a job. And part of that is that our model, and it's not to say that this is bad because it's the best that we could do in an analog world. People like me sit around in a room and we cook up a program and we put it on our course catalog, and we hope that somebody will take that course, will earn that degree, and we hope that the employer will hire them after they complete it. Well, hope is not a strategy. And so being on the supply side and not hewed closely to the labor market, that luxury really doesn't exist anymore. In the era of being able to sell $75,000 online master's degrees, that is not going to work anymore unless maybe your name's Harvard or Yale or something like that. So for the more scrappy R1s for community colleges, alignment to the labor market is going to be key. So having a talent marketplace that has those three pieces, the credential registry, the LER, and the job description generator, that's why we designed the nation's first definition of talent marketplaces that first went into the Federal Register as part of Secretary McMahon's supplemental grant priorities, but it also got it integrated into the Match Act that Congressman Owens introduced a few weeks ago that I've learned today is going to be marked up tomorrow, so hopefully that will go well. So we are, perhaps not at the end, we're not at the beginning, we're at the end of the beginning of this work, because I think have established a beachhead to where this is not just avant-garde, sort of esoteric on the side. The work that we're talking about here of integrating credit, non-credit, formal, informal learning, that is becoming the bread and butter of what college presidents are spending their time talking about. That's what boards of trustees are talking about. That's what members of Congress are talking about. So that in and of itself, everybody in this room is to be commended and to be congratulated, because you have shifted the Overton window of what's possible. These are conversations that were happening in very small circles, did not have the throughput that could make meaningful change even 5 years ago. So the fact now that we're close to getting a federal definition for a talent marketplace, that's exciting, but it's necessary, but it's not fully sufficient. So now what we've got to do is to make sure that, and I may sound like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth, so let me kind of square the circle here. If we know that the states are going to be the laboratories of innovation, certainly over the next couple of years, but we know that we can't live in a world where there's no consistency. And back to the Tower of Babel example, if I just on my trip to work today was in 3 subnational boundaries because traffic got too bad and I had to go over the bridge in Alexandria through Maryland and got woken up by a good whiff of the DC water treatment center over there. But just imagine if, next year, if Virginia, DC, and Maryland all have a talent marketplace and those are not interoperable, what value is that to anybody, right? And so we've got to make sure that, and I see Jennifer with IEEE here, we've got a lot of great standards that have been set, WC3, all the work that the sort of Digital Badge Consortium has done. So we've got the standards, but as I like to say, if you go out and yell in the woods and nobody hears you, did you actually yell? And we talked about that in my office, right, Jennifer? So now what we've got to do is help to inform, advocate, educate. It's kind of like weeding the garden. We're going to have a bunch of new governors this year, and so it's a lot of cyclical work, and I know it can kind of wear you out, but it's good work. It's good work to be done, because the biggest threat that we have right now is the inertia tending back towards the status quo. And that is a clear and present danger, not only because of nothing ages more poorly than yesterday's politician except their pet project. So if it's only just about one governor in time, or it's only about one administration, that doesn't have as much throughput. So that's why you carrying this into your institutions, empowering trade associations, unions, employer groups to carry this forward. So as you get a new governor, or even when you have candidates for governors and every other office in the state, that this becomes so enmeshed into the status quo of your state that they would be foolhardy to even think about going back in another direction. And to be honest with you, the other big risk that we have here is a shifting labor market. So 2 years ago, when the first Skills in the States convening was up here, and now we're having the second one, you had the CEO of Walmart, you had the CEO of McDonald's, Home Depot. Seemed like half the Fortune 100 was up on the stage talking about tight labor markets, and they continue to be tight. But I think it's becoming more attuned to particular industries, and it's softening up in some others. So the biggest risk, and God forbid we ever go into another recession. I certainly hope it doesn't happen on our watch, but it will happen at some point, right? And so the biggest risk that we have is that we start thinking about retraining and reemployment again, and our old ways of the public workforce system, and we don't have the momentum to carry this forward so that it becomes really enmeshed into how we do things. So one of the biggest opportunities I think we have is working with our nation's secondary career and technical education system, our public workforce system funded through WIOA, the registered apprenticeship system, and Workforce Pell. So if we think about sort of our key non-degree credential policy levers and opportunities, if I'm in a state or governor institution, that's what I'm thinking, how do I connect all those dots? Then I'd hire Steve Wojtek, since he kind of deals with all those all at the same time. But seriously, that I think is the way for us to get the best wellspring from which to build this out, because there is going to be, will continue to be, a spectrum of early champions, and a lot of this is a change management process where you got to get the right institutional leadership that's able to empower you to carry it forward. There's going to be some fence setters, and there's going to be some laggards. And so the strategy is for the champions to show the party photos to the fence setters, and you build up a coalition of the willing, and you get enough critical mass to where it becomes kind of like the snowball rolling down the hill. So that is kind of my challenge to you, is to consider yourself, whatever, how you may think, well, what does that mean? Well, whatever your font of leadership. I mean, because all of us are leaders in this room. You've got influence on people who you can expand this coalition of folks that are working with us here, and just try to make sure that they understand all of the issues. What are the challenges? What are the risks? And what are maybe some of the things that we haven't thought about? And as I said to the last group that we spoke with earlier today, the skills in the states convening, I think the conversation around AI and non-degree credentials and talent marketplaces is important, because if you spend much time up here, how many people are based in DC? Okay, well, quite a bit, but so y'all will know, and enough of you are here enough to also know that there's a lot of navel gazing right now about generative AI. And we're kind of in two camps nationally, where half the country's a Luddite, and I alluded to that earlier, and they think that all of our jobs are going to get wiped out in 2 years by AI. And then the other half are kind of irrationally exuberant, thinking that AI is going to be a panacea to all the world's challenges. And so the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but where we really can add value is looking at the applied use cases. And so the applied use case can really be thought of as talent marketplaces, non-degree credential work, and being able to leverage language models to be able to articulate all of the vast corpus of all of our coursework, all the things that are coded in seat time and competencies. And imagine how we can do things like scale credit for prior learning if we didn't have to just do that piecemeal, one faculty assertion at a time. Or think about how this could transform statewide articulation agreements, or even eventually into a national articulation agreement that's based on skills matches. Think about how we could reimagine our UI system if, rather than having to apply for 3 jobs a week to be in compliance with UI work search, that you could click a button and apply for 500 jobs based on your geography and your skills profile. Think about how we could reimagine the intake of our WIOA system, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, that's stuck in a low investment, low outcome equilibrium trap. Congress doesn't want to put more money into it because it's not putting out the results that are needed, and so that's just a doom loop. And states and people that are doing this work can make that intervention to show that before we can say, yes, WIOA can, we also got to make sure that when we do intake for somebody, we're able to say, what skills are you coming in with? If I'm a veteran with a joint service transcript, why are we not awarding PLA on site with one cross-trained person that can co-enroll me in multiple different programs, give me human services, give me the right training program, and maybe I do get started with a non-degree program, and I'm looking at a combined list of maybe tab A is the eligible training provider list, tab B is Workforce Pell programs, and there's going to be quite a bit of overlap between those. And those are just a few, of the use cases that can happen when you leverage together both the policy and the research work that this group is doing and the power of AI. So rather than just being a shill for all of the great things that it may or may not do, or somebody that's just digging their head in the sand and hoping that it doesn't actually come to fruition, let's think about how we apply that in our individual context. So what I want to do is close by seeing if anybody has any questions or ideas that they'd like to share. I think you guys do, because you've been quite active there. So, yeah.
Maybe you could start by telling us about the state of the Alabama Talent Triad today, some of the difficulties it's faced in coming to sort of whatever state of maturity it's in, and what that tells us about the sort of bigger picture nationally about the aspirations you've expressed.
Yeah. Well, the Alabama Talent Triad is back in 2023 launched as the nation's first full-scale talent marketplace that had those 3 components that I described. Personnel is policy, right? And so when there's shifts and there's transitions, sometimes things can run askance. And so I would say the talent triad right now is probably in limbo and I think it can be salvaged. But right now, I think there's just been some salutary neglect on it, and it has not had the sort of right leadership from the highest levels that it did have that would continue to encourage institutions and employers to participate. Institutional participation is not the big problem. The big problem is employer participation. Because most employers don't feel that they have any need to fool with stuff like that. They feel like, I can complain a little bit and get some training from the government that can help me get some people in the immediate sense, or I can just revert back to what I've been doing before. And then there's an anti-competitive bias, I think. There's this notion that if I'm sharing too much data and putting, showing my cards too much, that I'm opening myself up, what I mentioned earlier, of losing my employees to my competitors maybe for a quarter more an hour. But I do think there is a base of employers in certain industries that are going to have a stronger affinity for doing things like this than others. And I would say those that don't fall into that monopson, and I'm not saying monopsonist trap, to where your sort of goal in business is to depress your wage thresholds enough to where you can kind of just keep churning through bodies, and you don't end up having to have a self-sufficient wage. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
I have several, but one sorry. No, I mean, thank you, by the way, for the overview. I always, listening to you kind of talk about these different ideas, I always appreciate you do an excellent job of kind of unpacking, the main issues. And one thing I was just thinking about, because you brought it up too, is like we have these towers of Babel, right? So if every state is going to do kind of their flavor of a talent marketplace, or even an LER or digital wallets or whatever, it reminded me of conversations I think this group has had even before I attended, which was, could we come back to some type of a national repository or database of learners, right? So at the national level, there was a way to be able to better track, someone from K through 12 to post-secondary, or if they leave without the degree, we have a sense of, their first jobs and things like that. So do you think that there's maybe like a renewed interest in terms of collecting data about the learner more at the national level, so that there could be less likelihood for there being, people speaking different languages about the same things?
I think if we lived in a perfect world and there wasn't politics, we could do that. But I've thought about that a lot, and particularly when I was at the state level, I really wished for something like that. But now that I'm at the federal level, I think about it a little bit differently from two perspectives. One, we don't want the work of all the states to be held hostage by whoever happens to be at the White House at the time. So, your guy or gal may be in 1 year, and the next 4 years they're not. And so the pendulum swings too much in federal policy and just the dynamics of that if all of the work at the state level is caught in a federal bottleneck, I think that'd be tough just from the practical sense of the work. Also, in having to deal with all of the, what I would say is insanity surrounding the Common Core debate back, and I know this is very different and tangential to that, but when we start talking about tracking people nationally or some national data set, all of those folks come out of the woodwork, and it creates a life of its own. So maybe there will, I just don't think we're quite there yet, but I do think, and this was our thinking with the CTO challenge, Connecting Talent to Opportunity, which we were glad that we had 20 states to apply for that. And I'm glad I still got 15 minutes. I thought you were about to kick me off the stage. So, no, that's good. So you're helping remember things I forgot to mention in my talk. So with the CTO challenge, we thought about that. It's like, what's the right balance we can strike, knowing, that all the work I do with Jason Tisco and the chamber around the new data paradigm, the idea that we've got all these SNAP and TANF Medicaid work requirements that are coming online, that we do not have robust formula funding for data enhancement, you know, the UI enhancement dollars or the WDQI SLDS are either random or disconnected or assume things that shouldn't be assumed. So, you know, like the SLDS thinks the SEA must be the grants manager. So in Alabama, we ended up having to have this tortured agreement to where we had to shift money across 3 different agencies just to get it where it needed to be. So what we're trying to do with the CTO challenge in the first phase is to create a group of states that will reach consensus on what are those standards, like the one that Jennifer, and without going on the litany of all the, if you're a standard setter in the room, raise your hand. Standard setting body. Okay. Who do you represent?
I'm affiliated with one, was.
Got it. Okay, so what we want to do through the CTO challenge is it helps states to call balls and strikes between vendors and standards. And I think the right sort of benign but important federal role as we go forward is going to be through when we reach as good a consensus as we can to imbue those requirements as either direct priorities or at least supplemental priorities in our federal grants going forward. In the same way that we ended up banning drunk driving and ended up with the same width lanes in the interstate through the Highway Trust Fund. You know, if you don't have a law that bans underage drinking and you have narrow lanes, you're not going to get your trust fund dollars. So I think that's probably has the most fecundity right now in the federal role of through influence and convening and working with groups like this, but using our grant making ability to say we've got all these different standards, and it's kind of the not wild west of not only standards but also credentials. That's becoming cliche at this point, and just trying to bring some clarity to that. I'll also say that I think a big issue we're going to have to solve for is assessment. And I know that one inertia that we face is disparate impact compliance. And I think while all of those were well-intentioned, the idea is that we don't want people being screened out because they're being assessed in a way that's biased. But I think the irony of that is it's metastasized into a position to where there are a lot of very good jobs and a lot of really good ways that employers would like to assess people that don't have a degree, but they got to pop in a degree as a proxy, and they get a really inarticulate screening mechanism, and they got to go further and do all these things beyond that. So I think another way that we can work to solve for that, in lieu of, I know there's a lot of work going on in the White House. We'll just see how far they can get with that. I mean, it's sort of a, but it's like case law, and EEOC doesn't have direct rulemaking authority, so they need somebody to challenge it and so on. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't really understand all of that. I just know it needs to be solved, but the pathway to solving it legally is probably pretty narrow. But what we can do is work through sectoral partnerships and sector strategies to say, here are the skills that we believe that you need to have in this occupation. And we think about it in tiers of, here's what, essentially skills that would be most generally applicable across the greatest number of occupations. And then what are the ones that are for an entry-level job specific to this industry? And then what are the ones down to, the 4- and 6-digit SOC code? And then we start thinking about really having a proliferation of artifact demonstration-based assessments. And so just like I think you can't think of competency-based education in isolation of skills-based hiring, you're not going to be able to think about really getting non-degree credentials to be mainstreamed until we have a lot of new assessments on the market. But the big assessment companies, they just are really stuck on that legal compliance side of things, and we got to work past that. Yes, sir.
I'll comment and then a question. I really believe that assessment is one of the keys as we move forward. There are a lot of innovation, but very little money toward outcome research to determine impact. and what it's really doing. And that leads me to my question. I'm very concerned about the ding-dong word credentials of value as to what is value in the regard, and especially like in the world that I come from, in the certification world. The whole purpose of certifications is to protect the public, not necessarily a jump in salary or and sometimes like child care workers, social workers, nursing home workers. Those are essential to the infrastructure of our country, and yet they cannot be evaluated by that criteria. Do you have some thoughts about and if you leave it to the states, we're going to have 15 different ways of determining credentials of value, I'm afraid, and maybe you all could provide some general guidance about data sets and variables that we think would allow for more flexibility of looking about how it does serve society?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of back to the point that was made over here. I mean, I know the sort of ultimate solution would be to have some sort of a national quality framework, but I think the reality is that we're just not going to have that, and there's not the political. Yeah, right. I just don't think that that's going to happen. So I think what we've got to do is deal with what is possible, and knowing that credentials of value will mean something different in every state, because Congress made the definition of a recognized post-secondary credential that has about as much clarity as mud, right? It could mean something totally different. And that's why our eligible training provider list scenario is as chewed up as it is. So if we think about certifications, licenses, occupational licenses, we as states are developing their transparency and quality frameworks, if we actually did have a true system to where every state had a credential registry that is transparent, you could go on and look and say, here's a credential, here's all the competencies that underlie it, here's the jobs that are either directly aligned or adjacent to it, then I think that all of that data in and of itself would be a huge boon to researchers. So I think that in the short term is probably as close as we're going to get. But in those areas where there's the risk for moral turpitude or health and life and limb, those I think we've got to pay particular care to those, and maybe also think about relaxing some of those occupational licenses where they're not needed. And that's something that was interesting to me, and I think it becomes somewhat tangential in the non-degree credential work. But there's a lot of occupations in states that have some really bizarre regulations on it. And I won't go through some of the more strange examples that I found in my own state. But I would imagine that you've got those sort of idiosyncrasies nationally, and that could be some area that could be ripe for potential DOL leadership on. Probably got time for two more if I don't filibuster the answers. I can juggle if you don't have any.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about your thinking for states in terms of how you would advise to kind of think about all the things you talked about from an economic development standpoint. Mm-hmm. How do we put that? Is that a framework that we can think about from the state perspective?
Yeah, I think the number one question that site selectors and economic developers are asking right now is, how can you guarantee that I'm going to have a skilled workforce? And not just through economic development, pre-employment training incentives where we're just churning through people, but an organic talent pipeline that begins with K-12 and then goes all the way through the workforce. And so it's somewhat of an existential slap for a lot of people when they hear me say that education serving two customers, the students and their families, but also employers. And those things, just like time and credit-based assertions and non-credit, don't have to be mutually exclusive. Neither does the outcome of our post-secondary system. So when we know that we can't think about economic development, education in silos, really we got to think about workforce and education as talent development that's just a little bit upstream from economic development. So that's part of the reason why And not everybody agrees with it, so you can, probably, we've got more to prove it out. But we're trying to build a unified talent development agency within the Department of Labor. So that's why we're thinking about, so if you think about the fact, if you're a governor, you get 8 to 10% of your overall spend from the feds. The rest of it's state and local. Now, we can talk about the conversation about how much of the rules and the regulations come federal, or at least either directly or implied. So we're trying to reverse that and to say we're losing people at these different points of slippage, where a kid comes into preschool with a 30 million word gap, or a student enters into the 3rd grade not literate, or the 5th grade not numerate, or if you go into an elementary school, all the kids are happy, but you go to the middle school, and if you don't keep them grounded in their interests and aptitudes and aspirations, you lose them. And that all culminates in the fact that we've got 1 out of 4 of our youth that are not going to school, not going to work, and we've got a very anemic labor force participation rate with a really big problem for young men. And we don't have the time to get into all that, but that's the challenges we're facing. So what can we do to help at least eliminate some of those points of slippage? And we think that one of the best things to do is, rather than having 43 various and sundry workforce programs spread across 10 federal agencies that are so prescriptive and are so focused on kind of a safetyism around small amounts of dollars, and nobody was really worried about the hundreds of billions that go towards 4-year degrees that aren't really assessed for quality. So we could do a better job if we've got those dollars more consolidated and a lot more flexibility in the hands of governors to deploy them. And we could have sat around and wrote white papers about it for 4 years like a lot of other administrations did, but we wanted to create a proof of concept in the hopes that Congress will codify that, and still have faith that they will at least make some meaningful progress. My time is up. Yeah.
She said
Yeah.
you can keep going.
Okay,
We
great.
have one more question. You had a question,
Perfect.
right? Did someone else have a question? You have a question?
Thanks. This is great. Chad Knights, Northern Virginia Community College. Good seeing you. We just saw each other a couple weeks ago.
Yeah,
Here.
good to see you.
So you mentioned the piece about the employers and their connection to talent markets and development of sort of the credential pools. I'm curious if you've thought through ways to how you might. So we have great partners that when the talent is desperate, that are engaged, but some are even developing and building their own training programs, their own pathways that have sort of cut out the higher ed. So just, have you thought about ways to incentivize employers to engage in that space a little bit more, like in earnest, to really help build up that marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think we spent a lot of time thinking about that on Workforce Pell, and thinking about, Congress over-engineered it to where you've got to have, it has to be all Title IV eligible institutions, and every bit of the program has to be Title IV eligible. But when we think about particularly short cycle and short-term workforce training, when you're co-designing programs with employers, or you think about registered apprenticeship, the reality is that some element of the instruction probably is better delivered by the employer, because you don't have to sit there and go and buy some $200,000 tool and die machine every 5 years just to keep current with industry. But there's also elements of it that are going to be better delivered by you. And so by leaving you to at least have, I wish we could have done more. It's 25 for the sort of non-eligible provider, and 50 for if it's a registered apprenticeship. And, we'll see. I think if Congress looks at Workforce Pell and sees that they erected a barrier that was too high on it, they may have to walk some of that back, particularly if states are only having like 4 or 5 programs that meet this pretty onerous bar. We don't need to see a SHIO being able to get a PhD approved in their state quicker than you can get a Workforce Pell program. So I'm not saying anything to them. I haven't told the committee and other folks there, but so I think co-designing in mind with, what's the practical way, whether it's student K-12 pedagogically or an adult practically, to make sure that we are delivering that in the setting that just helps that person get the skills they need in an applied way, and is efficient, cost effective, and gets them more quickly, not only into the job, but to persist in the job too.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other burning questions? Okay.
thought he had a question. We need to take a picture. Yeah.
Follow-up.
Sure.
Because probably asking this out of ignorance, but in regard to what you were talking about, in regard to, sometimes the best laboratory is the employer. Under the Pell workforce, would it not qualify if it was part of an internship or a residency of the Title IV institution? Would that suffice or not? Where they would be part of a total package, but led by the Title IV institution?
Yeah, I mean, if the training or the instruction is being provided by a Title IV eligible entity, then that's all good. Now,
And the employee would be an adjunct faculty kind of a
yeah,
person?
then we don't even get into that situation. Where we get into this situation is if the Title IV Workforce Pell eligible institution partners with Jim Bob's, plumbing company. And Jim Bob can only provide 25%.
Yeah, okay.
That was the name of an actual plumbing company in town. Yeah. Other questions?
Anything to say about, I feel like one of the buzzwords other than AI is apprenticeships.
Yeah.
But I feel like we're still, like in higher ed and also in K through 12, I still feel we've still missed the ecosystem, right? We know there's lots of different, work-based projects, service learning, all these things in between. And so I'm just wondering, is there, outside of philanthropy, in your opinion, is there any support at the federal level, maybe through the governors, to have a bigger conversation about how higher ed can do more around, helping more of its learners actually get those work-based learning opportunities, whether it's through Parker Dewey or Ripen or virtual internships or extern, there's lots of technology platforms that support it, but then when I talk with certain institutions, they're not, it's just not on their radar because I think there's a cost to it, and also there's a capability lack, right?
Yeah.
So many schools just don't really have the bandwidth to actually work with a lot of employers in a proactive way to get access to work-based learning, whether it's in a team or on an individual basis. Strata, and not Strata, but the Business Higher Education Forum study. And we also know just in general, right, internships are lacking. So I almost feel maybe at the state level and also at the federal level, there could be more attention brought to other things other than just apprenticeships.
Yeah. But no, that's a fair point. That's something that we focused heavily when I was at the state level. There's a spectrum of work-based learning. It begins with career exploration, culminates with RAPS and as the gold standard. But there's also a lot of high-quality employer-based training programs that all for not having the imprimatur of DOL on there would be a registered apprenticeship. And so I think that, if we think back to the first Trump administration, there were IRAPs. And the notion was, the traditional registered apprenticeship system is being gatekept by 2 or 3 industries. So what we're going to do is create this parallel system that is somehow going to be more employer-driven. I liked that model up until I recognized that these standards recognition entities were actually going to be able to usurp the role of the state apprenticeship agency and being able to certify those. So that's where they kind of lost us on that. But what we're trying to do this time is to say, let's make the registered apprenticeship model work for more than just the skilled trades and construction industry, because we got to be honest with ourselves. The Fitzgerald Act in 1937 is 2 pages long, and from that, due to the Chevron deference, it's now no longer the law of the land. We erected thousands of pages of regulations in 29 Part 20 and 30 and Part 30 and 30. And that has really resulted in this dueling and I'll use the term again, safety dance around registered apprenticeship to where it's almost the assumption that there's this big line of employers waiting to sign up, and they're not. I mean, so we've already got child labor laws. We already got, anti-discrimination laws. We already got wage and hour laws. So why does the apprenticeship sponsor have to jump through those hoops twice? There's not any regular formula funding for registered apprenticeship. You get these state apprenticeship expansion grants and that assume there's some general connection to WIOA other than the sponsor may be able to put it on the ETPL. There's really not, if we're being honest, as well as there should be. We're working to try to make that stronger. Still got a lot of work to do. But I would say if Congress can do anything for us, it would be to give us some direct formula funding to where governors have a regular source of funds to provide incentives. But we need to simplify the design to where we're doing three things basically. We're co-designing the RTI with the employer. We're providing supportive services that are the first and last dollar barriers that make or break somebody completing and placing and having a job, a year after being employed in the job for which they train. Soften up some of these really tight journey ratios that don't make sense for everybody. If you're on a production line, you really need somebody 1-to-1 ratio there. It's a little bit different if maybe you're, learning how to do surgery or something like that. And then, subsidizing wages, because the idea is that the employer is taking a bet on somebody that's not fully productive, and that person needs to make a family sustaining wage. The employer needs a little bit of help because they're employing somebody at a rate that can't be borne by the market without some intervention. And then lastly, I'd say we need to do a better job supporting and funding intermediaries. There's too much red tape and compliance that goes along with RAPs. So if we're going to make that more than 3 or 4% of the pathways for most people, you've got to take a lot of that, workaday stuff, not only off of the employer, but off of the apprentice and also somebody that, like an institution that's providing the RTI. So for a lot of people, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. We're trying to turn that around and not just creating some new system. That's what I learned in the state, is that if you got a bureaucracy that's not doing its job, you don't want to just create a new bureaucracy. You got to fix the one that's the underlying problem.
Okay. Well, I think that's it.
All right.
Thank you so much, Nick,
Thank you.
for all of your
Appreciate it.
insights.